Alright, so I'm going to show you real quick some of these components that are listed here and go with a brief detail on what each one is. A CPU. A CPU looks like this, first of all. It's got a lot of little pins, as you can see. Kind of hard to see, but there's a lot of pins. It's square normally in shape, and on the motherboard, so this is the motherboard of an existing computer, it would go right in here. So that's how you identify your CPU. Usually it's square, it will have a lot of little pins, and it goes in an area in a square of a motherboard. Okay, and that's the central processing unit. It's basically the brain of the computer. Now the L1 and the L2 cache also reside within this CPU, and it's a shared memory that it uses to process information. You guys are going to have to look up L1 and L2, exactly the definitions and the differences. I couldn't tell you, other than I know that L1 uses SDRAM and L2 uses DRAM. Okay? So that's the CPU. The next component on the list is, let's see, well, the bus. We'll get into the bus in a second. The hard drive. Alright, so a hard drive is basically looks like this. It's square, it's pretty big, and it normally sits on the side of a computer. I don't know what you guys are going to have to identify, but it could sit in here like this. Okay, so this is a hard drive. Alright, memory. This is the memory. That's what the memory stick looks like. Alright, and usually on the motherboard it sits in slots, in long slots like this, and it just sits straight up. Okay, so that's the memory. And then power supply. Usually the power supply of the computer is up at the top here. Okay, and on the back it's got a big opening for the fan and where the power cord plugs in right here. Okay, so this is your power supply, and the wires from that go in and plug into the motherboard, and that's what gives the whole computer power. Usually the power supply plugs into a little square plug like this on the motherboard. Okay, next is the serial sound port. The sound. Okay, the sound comes from the motherboard most of the time, and it looks like right here. So it's part of the motherboard, and you've got different plug-ins, one for your sound, microphone, bass, etc. Okay, or it could be what's called a sound card, depending again on what computer you're looking at. This is a card that plugs into one of the ports in the computer right here. Okay, so it would be here, it would plug in like this, and it would have the same, once it's plugged in, it would be on the back side here, down here, one of these openings. It would stick out the back, and when it sticks out, it would look something like this. As far as the ports, would be the same thing. It'll be a green, always green for the speaker, and pink for the microphone. Some boards may not have 6 like this one does. On this computer, for example, there's only 3, as you can see, and it's one green and pink again, green speaker, pink microphone. So that's what the sound is. So it could be either, the sound can either be what's called onboard, which is part of the motherboard, or it can be external, which could be a card. Okay, the CD DVD player, obviously that's on the front of the computer right here, is where you put in your CDs and DVDs, and on the back it kind of looks like this. This is what it looks like pulled out of the computer. Okay, So that plays your DVDs or CDs. The serial port on a computer is this one right here. Let's see, some of them have them, some of the older ones don't have them. Here's a serial port right here. And the way to tell the difference is it's one of the only ports that does not have, it has pins sticking out. You see these little pins right here? So that's a serial. This port right here on the back of the computer, the blue one normally is for your video, for your monitor, and that's called the VGA port. Okay? I know that's not part of your thing, but you see how the holes, you actually have to plug something in? So this is a male pin because, you know, they're sticking out, and the rest of them are female plugs, and that's how you differentiate the serial port. Okay, so that's the serial port. Alright, so the only thing we haven't talked about is the bus. Okay, so going back to the last thing on the list here, the bus. The bus is kind of, it's not as easy to point out because it's not exactly one thing. What the bus is the way I was explaining, is that it's kind of like the highway that all these components that we just talked about communicate with each other. So you've got the CPU, where the CPU rests here, that communicates with the RAM, which is the memory. And then you got the PCI. These are called PCI slots for video, audio, networking. These can be used for different, they communicate with the CPU. So the bus, we're gonna need to read exactly what definitions and what has been provided to you in your materials to figure out what that is, okay?